Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Diana Putri and I will be guiding the transition as our final session of the day. We have now arrived the roundtable discussion on Russia's war in Ukraine global perspective. This session brings together leading experts to reflect the key themes of today's program and offer broader perspective from different regions. And this session will be chaired by Dr. Adam Holash from IBEI. And Mr. Adam, the time is yours.
Hello, good afternoon, good evening to our final event today. All right, which we started with an excellent keynote. Then we had some panels on the topic security structure. Also some panels. The last panels of the afternoon were on European values and how they are reflected in the recent European politics. And right now we come to the round table. As one of the undergraduate students asked me, where is the table? It's not round. It's the concept, right? So let's keep it like this. Okay, so I will present the panelists following the order, like we had it in the program. So first, Professor Jang-Hoon Han from the Seoul National University. He's professor at the Graduate School of International Studies, expert in Korean politics, party politics, comparative politics, and in the European Union. Big applause for him. Second, we have Professor Radityo Dharmaputra. He's a lecturer of foreign policy analysis at the Universitas Airlangga. He's one of the biggest experts on the Ukraine-Russia war in Indonesia. A big applause. Then third, we have Kuri Maharani Savitri. She's a lecturer here at BINUS of Conflict and Security Studies. She was also responsible for defense task with the Ministry of the Defense of the Republic of Indonesia. Big applause. Then we have Professor Maiko Ishihara. She's professor at School of International Public Policy at the Hitotsubashi University in Tokyo, Japan. Thank you for coming. And as the fifth panelist, we have Mariam Ahrabagi from the Kimip University in Almaty, Kazakhstan. She's the research coordinator of the Kimip University, but also she's developing right now a research on the perception of the European Union in Central Asia, which was one of the papers today. A big applause. So before starting, maybe I give you a little bit the idea how we want to structure this. So the first round will be on the perceptions of Russia's war in Ukraine in the different countries, right? The second round of questions will be evaluating the role of the European Union in this conflict, how these countries. Now it's more about the global perceptions, how these experts from these different countries see European Union's role, and the third round will be focused more on the recommendations, right? How the European Union could improve, in which direction the European Union could move, all right? So I start with the round first and the perceptions of the war in your country, and here I would turn to Radityo and the perception of the war in Indonesia. Indonesia first.
Okay, I thought it would be Korea first. Okay, thank you, Adam, for the questions. How many minutes do I have for the just short? Okay.
Not short, as long as you
Really? Okay. Sorry. Yeah, because I've written a lot about this, several articles already. So I'll just summarize briefly what my thinking about this. And again, a disclaimer first. I'm probably more closer to the EU because I spent 5 years in Estonia for my master and PhD. So probably you have a very different views to the other Indonesian. I'll try to map what Indonesians usually think about Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine. So I think we need to understand that to understand Indonesia, you have to differentiate between how the government think and how the society thinks. The government, if you look at how the Indonesian government act since 24th February 2022, mostly ambiguous in what I mean by ambiguous or neutral, to quote a former high-ranking ministers, we should be neutral in this war. What I mean by ambiguous and neutral is that in the UN, Indonesia's government tend to agree to most of the resolution against Russia. But at the same time, I don't think we ever mention Russia directly, criticizing Russia directly in any statement. We still invite Indonesia for the G20 in 2022. We attended the Peace Summit, but again, Indonesia decided not to sign the last one in Swiss. And President Jokowi in 2022, if I'm not mistaken, visited Kyiv and Moscow, trying to mediate between Russia and Ukraine. But it's mostly about Indonesia's own interests, about the food security at that time. And if you look at the current president, Indonesia's current president, one of the questions from Adam is what Indonesian government is thinking is responsible for the war, right? And you look at how the current president, President Prabowo, when he was still a minister of defense back in 2023, his speech in Shangri-La Dialogue, you can see that the blame is basically a proper. He shared the blame between between Russia and Ukraine. That's why all the discussion is about, creating what's the call again? The militarized zone, including a referendum in the occupied territories. That's why one of the outcomes that I think the Indonesian government think what will happen in Ukraine is this kind of negotiated peace. But if you look at how the government view the Russia-Ukraine war at the moment, is that the small countries has this, this bad luck of living to a bigger countries that you have to deal with it. Indonesia deals with China by trying to be, try to engage China, trying to have a negotiation. So Ukraine should do the same, or even being neutral. So that's the government's position. Again, President Prabowo mentioned several times that this invasion is basically proof that now the world is back to a realist world where the strong do what they can and what they want, the weak suffer. So you look at several dimensions of whether his speech in Shangri-La or after he became president as well. And you can trace it back to pragmatism, to historical dimension or historical closeness between Russia or at the time Soviet Union and Indonesia, how Soviet Union and Russia was framed as the Indonesia's friend back in the 60s. I argued in one of my other articles that Indonesian policymakers used to think that the ideal approach to mediating conflict is seeing the conflict as between brothers. So Indonesia and Malaysia, Kosovo. So it's always between one, with similar background. So that's how many elites view Russia and Ukraine, because it's for many Indonesians they're similar. Of course they're not, but again for many Indonesians. Just briefly go to society. I think society, you can even hear some of the discussion here in this conference. In the society there are more sympathy toward Russia, in a way. So you look at the history, the historical dimension. Again, look at how the people react. Look at how the political parties talk about the Russian invasion. It's always about going back to history. Oh, Soviets helped us before. Of course, there are anti-Westernism there, mostly anti-Americanism. So that's why the framing of the invasion, of the war, is always either it's a conflict, it's NATO against Russia, it's not about Ukraine, it's about the bigger power, it's about proxy war between Russia and the EU, or even the EU. So, and what doesn't help is the Western hypocrisy. in a way. I think we have to acknowledge that especially in Palestine and Gaza, that actually affect a lot of society, peoples in Indonesia, how they view the Russia-Ukrainian war. And if you ask who's responsible for many people in society, there was a survey by, I think, Lembaga Survey Indonesia back in 2022, 23. They ask who is responsible. They basically don't blame Russia and Ukraine, they blame NATO, which shows you how powerful the framing in NATO and Russia. So the conflict or the war is being framed by a lot, not only the elite, the academics and so on, by viewing it as more NATO versus Russia. And that affects the public's view. The outcome, if you look at several, if you look at social media, there are a lot of, in YouTube or in X before Instagram, TikTok, you can see that there is this myth of Russian military greatness, so the Russian military victory is still viewed there. If you look at op-eds, academics, so I traced the op-eds in two different mainstream media, in Kompas, Jakarta Post. You look at the last 2 years or 3 years, since 2022, there was always this discussion that Ukraine should be neutral, even though before that Ukraine is already neutral in their constitution. So, but again, that is something that not many Indonesians knows, but the idea of being neutral is very important. Again, it reflects Indonesia's position in many other tension between great powers. Lastly, I would also touch upon why, again, this is an interesting dimension. Mentioned history, anti-Westernism, Western hypocrisy, and so on, but one thing that is not, or it is clear for me, for who actually try to look at it, is how effective and how efficient Russia's soft power in Indonesia. I mean, you can call it soft power, you can call it propaganda, you can call it information and operations. However you call it, it's quite effective, right? We're using Russian media, targeting Indonesian youth, Indonesian academics, bringing Indonesians to the so-called occupied territories in Zaporizhia, for example, bringing journalists there. And it is basically pushing the Russian narrative into Indonesians. Again, combine it with history and others, it's very effective. So whatever the impact here, I mean, Kuri will talk more about the impact. But one thing for sure, I think, that you can see combining a more ambiguous, neutral, or pragmatic government with a more sympathetic society would then benefit Russia more than it benefits the EU or Ukraine in this case. I'll stop there, and then we can have more discussion. Thank you.
Right now, we could move to Japan, and Michael.
Thank you, Adam. Well, hearing how the Indonesian government and also the society responded to Russian aggression of Ukraine, the Japan case is a bit different from the Indonesian one. In Japan, we have nearly unified sort of support for Ukraine. In the society, both in the society and in the government. So, for example, for about 1 year since the aggression of Russia against Ukraine, actually Japan was the country where news about Russian invasion of Ukraine was aired the most in the entire world. So people's attention onto this war has been that strong, and it was also a unique case where the Japanese government applied sanctions to Russia, and also it was nearly the first time that the Japanese government accepted refugees from one country in such a big number. We actually accepted about 2,000 Ukrainian refugees, and they are entitled to have 5 years of residency, which probably can be extended if they have to. And also, Japan has been providing infrastructure support and reconstruction support and so forth for Ukraine. and played a role to persuade global South countries in the United Nations negotiation tables. And last but not least, Japan decided to increase its defense budget facing this situation, which was basically the same kind of approach as Germany did. And so there was really a big shift in the move that the Japanese government as well as the society took on this occasion. And I would say that there were mainly two reasons. One of them was that Japan basically considered the case of invasion against Ukraine as very similar to that of China's potential invasion of Taiwan. And so the entire society wanted to make sure that invasion of Taiwan will not happen. So for that sake, we needed to make sure that the sovereign state system will be maintained well. And the second reason why Japan placed so much importance on supporting Ukraine was because we see the change of international organizations in the global governance. The United Nations has been weakening its functions due to, for example, China's expanded influence in the United Nations, as well as Russia's boycott using vetoes. And so Japan basically perceives G7 as the main platform where those negotiations happen. And as a part of the G7 community, Japan thinks that it has the role to play. And that's how Japan has been supportive of Ukraine.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Han, South Korea.
Yeah, as Adam introduced me, I'm not the expert in the issue of security. So what I'm evaluating now about the South Korean perceptions and stance about the Russian and Ukraine war, that would be some kind of evaluation by one South Korean person who are working for the academia. That is my, I admit the kind of limitations about my evaluations. And then about the third questions raised by the Adam, the first one will be what is the perceptions about the Russia-Ukraine war in South Korea? Who are responsible for that kind of war? At the beginning of this kind of war, the Korean perceptions about the responsibility might be very debatable. The NATO could be take the stance to enlarge to the eastward of their territories, and that increase some kind of Russians like security concerns, and that could be the one region of the Russia-Ukraine war. That would be the one kind of understanding. And the other side, people of our society, they understand that this is some kind of like eagerness of the Russia to enlarge their Russian territories or so making the Ukraine under their control. So these two debatable understanding has been long rest during this war. But recently, some of the research on some of the delivering of exact information says that the first argument, the NATO's some kind of intentions to move toward the eastward, that is lacks the substantive evidence. So, and then people in South Korea understand very well about that kind of NATO's intention might not be based on exact evidence, and we are more sympathetic about the second approach, right? The Russia might be much more responsible to this war. And then moving toward the expectations about the outcomes, what will happen in the near future, we don't know, and we support that some kind of peaceful resolution of this kind of war, but we do not support the Trump's attempts. So instead of the directions made by the Trump's administration of the USA, maybe we Korean people are more supportive of the EU stance. So maybe some of the agendas suggested recently by the EU. But still, we are. So Korean people also are under some kind of fatigue, that because the war is lasted for a long time. So our interest how to be resolved this war might be weakened recently. Meanwhile, some of the other interest has been like emerging in our society. So the war will be end soon. That is our expectations. And then, if the war ends, then how the Ukrainian society can be reconstructed. So whether what kind of like contributions the South Korea can do, materialistically or like sympathetically. So maybe if there is some kind of help we can conduct for the Ukrainian society, then our society think that we can do as far as we can. And finally, the global impact of this Russia-Ukraine war. Yeah, these issues must be more important in our society, because as you may know, the North Korean army actually participated in the Russia and Ukraine war. And that is not just the like increasing the cooperation between Russia and North Korea. And there are two different outcomes from that kind of engagement of North Korean armies. The first one is that it actually has negative influence on the Korean Peninsula, the peace of the Korean Peninsula, because the North Korea usually this war is a war business, has some kind of gains, right? By sending their troops to the Russia, the North Korean government might be rewarded by the Russian government, and that kind of economic rewardness might be improved some of their economic status of the world society in North Korea. And many people might know that North Korea economy was downturning and deteriorating recently, but this Russia and Ukraine war becomes some kind of opportunity for the North Korea can improve their economic status. And we can see what would be the outcomes from this kind of economic changes in North Korea. They actually develop some kind of confrontational policies towards South Korea. So the North Korea did not change their some kind of stance from the peaceful resolution between North and South Korean issues, but from that peaceful resolutions, they take some more like aggressive stance in recently. That would be the one kind of outcomes we see now in Korean Peninsula. However, in the other side, there is some kind of positive effect because of this kind of North Korean status, improved status, and the increased cooperation between North Korea and Russia. The Japan and USA and South Korea become much more stronger allies. So we made in last year, July, we made some kind of MOU, military MOU between 3 countries, and that MOU actually move up our alliance, our cooperation into the mostly allies between the countries. So that Russian war has some kind of positive and negative influence in South Korea, but still that influence is aggravating in the peaceful situation of South Korean Peninsula. That would be what I'm trying to say.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting overview of the South Korean position. And next time I will introduce you as a security expert because you apparently are one. So that's not a problem. Let's move right now to Kazakhstan, Maria.
Thanks, Adam. I think compared to what we just heard about, particularly Japan and Indonesia, the picture in Kazakhstan is more nuanced, partly because of the shared history between Kazakhstan and Russia, and partly because of the greater shared history between Kazakhstan, Russia, and Ukraine. So I think there's a clearer picture when it comes to the official stance and official discourse. So in the official discourse, you have careful articulation of a legalized language most of the time. So yes, sovereignty, territorial integrity, things like that are always referenced. However, to articulate the responsibility on the official level, you do not see that. That's for the official discourse. But within the society, you have the whole spectrum from the pro-Russia to pro-Ukraine stance, but most of the people fall somewhere in between. And if you look at social media particularly, there are things that are, you can see stances that are mixed. So for example, you can be generally, a person would articulate a stance that is anti-war, but doesn't exclude or discount NATO's responsibility in the argument. So you see a lot of those going on. And I would say that would be the majority of the voices that are heard. So it's not one way or the other. It's not polarized that much. And there is an inferred responsibility to Russia as for starting the war, but there is also this historical background always in the context. So it is very much contextualized and acknowledged. Another thing that I can say is that the war fatigue is definitely there. So everybody hopes that within the first few months or year or the first year, a resolution will come in. But right now, the picture doesn't seem. I mean, it seems very much grim, and it is expected that it would be prolonged. So that is the expectation of the society. In terms of foreign policy, in general, I think there is a quiet realignment happening with the partnerships because Kazakhstan always followed this multi-vector foreign policy in terms of partnerships, particularly when dealing with great powers like for China, Russia, and the West, the collective West. But now it is pretty much divided between EU and the United States. So there is a bit of a realignment in terms of attracting new partners for foreign investment, for trade, and so on. But it's not. The country is not decoupling from Russia, and it will not be able to decouple from Russia for many, many historical reasons. So that would be my early take on that.
Okay, thank you very much. Also very interesting. We are not familiar, right, with the position of Kazakhstan usually in the debate. Right now, Kuri, the lessons learned for the Asia-Pacific region?
Thank you. I'll try to complement what Adityo has said about the impact of Russia's war in Ukraine. Russia, we have to acknowledge that it is no longer a great power. At least in Indo-Pacific, it's been categorized as middle power. If you look at Asia Power Index by Lowy Institute in Australia, and I think many experts have agreed on that. However, Russia, despite of its declining power, and also its its relatively small footprints, whether it's in economy, politics, military, and so on in the Pacific, especially in Indonesia, it retains capability to affect not only Indo-Pacific, also the world when it comes to the war. This is because Russia is, of course, major exporter of oil and gas, food, especially wheat, and then fertilizers, those that are traditionally imported by Indo-Pacific countries, especially ASEAN countries, including Indonesia. And when the war broke, this has hiked the price and also worsened economic inflation. Many countries in Indo-Pacific has to add budget to import energy to subsidize the hiking price. And although Indonesia isn't actually importing much from Russia because we sources our energy from Middle East, we still feel the impact. And probably most of the impact goes to food security issues. We feel it so much so as that the current government actually made food security as one of the priorities for, we call it Astachita, 8 priorities. And in reality, this has materialized in program to, we call it food estate, yeah, where the government opened so many lands to grow crops. And this, although it's probably might achieve a level of food security that Indonesia needs, but it's also actually threaten the energy transition that we want to prioritize in the future, because, you know, land has been opened and then it's deteriorate the climate issues. The second implications of war that we feel across ASEAN countries, especially Indonesia, is that we no longer have the liberty to choose where to purchase our weapon systems. And this is important for us because, as Laditya has mentioned, we want to stay in the middle, being neutral, not to be, you know, under pressure of either superpowers, China or US. So one of the strategic autonomy that we want to maintain is actually to choose our partner when it comes to arms import. And Russia has been known as the alternative supplier. For Indonesia, we don't have many of Russian weapons of origin, but what we have is the one with capabilities that we rely on for workhorse of our military. For example, the Mi-17 helicopters that is also being used for disaster response in Sumatra at the moment. And the fact that because of the war, some of big countries like Japan, Germany, and others have raised the defense budget, it means demands now outstrip supplies of several types of weapons, meaning that weapons are now being more expensive and it's no longer available for those who are not considered as close alliance. So for Indonesia, we have more difficult times, not only to choose our partner, but also to do modernization as planned. The other thing that I should mention here, I think following to what a professor from South Korea has mentioned about security issues, although the conflict is far away, but we also feel the security impact. Not only South Korea has to deal with the fact that North Korea sent the troops there, but Indonesia also feel the impact of recruitment foreign fighters. We had one incident, at least that we know of. Yeah, we don't know how many others of former Marines being recruited, and the former Marine then go viral, you know, saying that, oh, it's actually nice to go to real war, and then with all the incentives provided, I think there's an inherent danger of recruiting foreign fighters because they would see this as, you know, the source of economic income, especially so in a country where economic growth has been not so good. Yeah. In all, what is the impact of the war for bilateral relations between Indonesia and Russia? First, with everything that happened, Russia is still perceived as the alternative geopolitical partners, especially as counterbalance to China. We feel that Russia is needed because it might be able to help us to deal with China. And this has been proven in the Compass survey. Compass is one of our largest media. It has survey in 2024, which asked the people about who do you think is the prospective counterbalance to China, and Russia came as the top second. So whether this is stemming from the truth or stemming from the misperception about Russia's power, I will tend to go for the first, actually. But the reality is, I think Southeast Asia, not only Indonesia, but Southeast Asia still feels that Russia is needed in the region. And the fact that Russia is also seen as a benign power because it never harms our country matters a lot when it comes to our response to the war. I think I will stop here.
Who's the first? US? US?
Okay, thank you very much. And this foreign fighter recruitment, so it was for Russia or because Russia? Okay, no. Now you're touching on very many topics which the public, for example, in Europe is not really aware of. So when you talk to experts in Europe, they know that the world is divided on the on these perceptions and also on the positions. But as Raditya say, there is a difference between the decision makers in the society and the European society in general thinks that everyone is on the side of Ukraine. So which is for that reason we also do the panel, right, to put try to draw this bigger picture. The second, let's start with the second round, and here I would like to ask you about the perception of the role of the European Union in this conflict. Especially we were connected to the European values, which also this conference deals with, right? This upholding peace, freedom, and this multilateral world order. So maybe we start with Professor Hahn, and then we move right. So I don't have to stand up.
Yeah, actually, about the European Union's roles on this war in South Korea, the perception is relatively low. So we, because of the geographical distance between EU and South Korea, the South Koreans has very low understanding about what EU do. But within that kind of little understanding, but most of South Koreans support that what EU did for in three aspects. The first one will be the dealing with the Russian-Ukraine war within as a making the war as a local confrontation, not extending to other regions. So some kind of containment of the territory regions of the war was successfully made by the EU's approach. And also the EU accept and accommodate many refugees from the Ukrainian society, and that kind of like humanitarian aid to the Ukrainian society that was very praised by our Korean peoples. And finally, some kind of like democratic norm, like providing against the Russian invasions to the Ukraine war, that was highly supported by the Korean people in that aspect. But still, we are if we see the public perceptions in South Korea, South Koreans wonders why the European countries did not send their ground troops to the Ukraine war. So that actually results from the low understanding about what EU is. So in South Korea, if you see the South Korean mass media report, then many like experts explains that why the EU cannot directly engage into the war by sending the ground troops to the Ukrainian society. And also, the people also recognize that, also doubt that whether the accommodating Ukrainian refugees within the EU society, whether that kind of accommodation is like limited into some regions, like some eastern part of the European society, not the western part of the European society. And whenever we see some kind of report about accommodating the refugees from the Ukraine, then that is the Poland words, that is the some other countries located at the center of the EU, not the western part of the European society. So in South Korean, people are wondering about why the kind of like policies at the EU levels accommodating the Ukrainian peoples and humanitarian act can be limited into the geographically. That would be also the another questions many South Korean experts try to resolve to make our people understand about the EU's approach. Yeah.
I think it's very interesting because you see the surveys that Kuri mentioned before. If you look at other survey, ICS survey, for example, like yearly or annual survey, you will always see the EU Indonesian mindset is a bit higher than probably the other countries. Right? Also very interesting that people in Indonesia frame it as NATO, not EU, even though the 2014, 13-14, the Revolution of Dignity, it's about the EU, it's about not about NATO. But the way people frame it is actually probably beneficial in a way to the EU because it's not part of that. But at the same time, I mentioned before that there is especially when you compare it to, I think the other panel before talked about how the EU is seen as a hypocrite because of Gaza, because of Syria, because of Ukraine, and so on. So there is that side, right? There is also a side when I think after 2022, I think the European Union try its hardest to help Ukraine, and that came out as pushing Indonesia, always talking about Ukraine whenever the EU delegation, for example, meet Indonesian delegation. And at one point, that actually, let me put it in a more, it's not in a, I don't know. I was part of this discussion, track 1.5 dialogue, a couple of months ago, and it was part of the discussion that Indonesian delegation felt frustrated because it's always the EU that wants to talk about Ukraine, whereas Indonesia doesn't want to talk about Ukraine. Indonesia wants to talk about the EU, about CEPA and so on. So there is this notion inside Indonesian, especially decision makers probably, that why are you always talking about Russia and about Ukraine instead of talking about us here, Indonesia, EU? So there is that side. And of course, again, going back to Gaza and Palestine, that is creating a big problem. So EU is seen as, probably just trying hard to help Ukraine, but at the same time not as hard as helping the others. Even though, as probably Ambassador Chaibi would say some different things, but I think that would be very interesting to see, because the EU always maintain the notion that, we help Palestine a lot. Yeah, but no one knows about it, at least in Indonesia. The mindset is always that the EU is not really helping them. And you can see from the other discussion. So I think there is a problem, that the role is perceived as, it's still good in general, the perception about the EU, because the other option is that no one knows about the EU because they only know about France, Germany, and big countries. But there is a good perception about the European Union, but at the same time there is that, especially when you focus only on Ukraine and Russia, that there is a big problem, a big gap with the EU in general and the EU in case of Russia and Ukraine. So I think that would be a good, probably a one of my points would be in the next round, because then what the EU needs to do to overcome that problems.
So departing from what Raditya has said before about EU being consistently seen as top alternative partners for ASEAN countries when it comes to choices between China and US, and the first is always Japan, of course. So EU has carved a good position actually in the perception of Southeast Asia, while Russia, if you follow the same surveys, the IC survey has been diminished in terms of power and trust to them as a partners. And I would like to add that for Southeast Asian as well as to Indonesia, the war between Russia and Ukraine now remains one of the top geopolitical concerns because of their implication. And therefore, it is actually part of our concerns as well. So how about the EU? EU, as I said before, has always been consistent, seen as a good partner. However, we cannot disregard the fact that democracy in the EU is also under test. There's been democratic backsliding in some countries with renewed sense of xenophobic, which are also against us Asian, and therefore, although compared to what happened in the US at the moment, we still choose EU, for example, to go for having our education. But EU is not really in a good position at the moment, added to the what Raditya has said about being double standard when it comes to applying the same democratic and human rights value that you apply to Ukraine to the context of Gaza. So in addition to that, I think EU also not only try to impose its own agenda on Ukraine in the local, in the regional agenda, but it also try to push the envelope further by, for example, the narratives of strategic communication is done by Russia, when in fact other actors are doing the same thing. I think just last year, the Reuters uncovered this story about how the U.S. Defense Department has done misinformation with regards to the Chinese COVID vaccine during the pandemic at the risk of, you know, letting the populations of the Philippines not getting the vaccine that they need to protect themselves. So, I think what the Southeast Asian see and the EU feels as priority might be different. However, we still believe that the EU is one of the pillar for upholding democracy. I think the Southeast Asian, especially Indonesia, although we also experience the same democratic backsliding, we still believe that democracy is important, and that academics like me and Raditya believe that it has to be the values when it comes to solving the problem in Ukraine.
Well, from Japan's point of view, apparently EU's leadership is so important to buttress the international order, especially given that the second Trump administration has been making a lot of mess with the security situation. And so, well, for Japan, the negotiation which is going on between Russia and Ukraine has to be really well maintained by the European side, with the intervention of the European countries, not necessarily only EU, but European countries, given that European countries are having the division of labor amongst the countries. And the Takaichi administration, which is the current administration in Japan, upholds this conception of free and open Indo-Pacific. So we believe that Japan is in line with European countries in terms of the values. And yet, when it comes to, because I'm a pro-democracy scholar in the Indo-Pacific who is trying to create Indo-Pacific framework for democracy support. So for us, the current situation, as you said, of populism in Europe is a bit concerning. And so European countries are decreasing the amount of foreign aid in most of the countries. And so democracy support itself is also weakened. So from our point of view, especially from those pro-democracy actors' point of view, we have to reach out not only to European countries, but also to private foundations or non-European partners like Taiwan to make sure that we can maintain the current international situation. Also, on the other hand, for Japan, the U.S. remains as the only ally, fortunately or unfortunately. And so we have to make sure that we maintain the United States to some extent on our side, so that they can play some positive role for the solution of Russia-Ukraine situation. And last but not least, given the most recent national security strategy of the United States is a bit concerning for probably many of the countries, but also for Japan as well. And for one thing, they have weakened the posture of support for Taiwan, and as a country which is now having a very severe confrontation with China, we have to pay close attention to that. So Japan has been trying to further strengthen its relations with other countries in addition to European countries, which is apparently mostly Asian democracies such as South Korea, India, Indonesia, the Philippines, Australia. And those European countries, maintain presence is in the most important.
In Kazakhstan, I think there are two layers to it. So the role of EU, EU as the as in general values and norms, yes, it is still there. It is seen as, for example, every undergrad student would like to go to the EU to do graduate studies. So that brand, that normative brand is still there. However, when you contextualize it within the war, what happened was initially, I would say within the first year, there was this hope that it can turn into concrete action and help end the war. However, at this point, I would say that the general understanding is that it is more an inspirational or aspirational stance rather than operationalized or something concrete that could help end the war. And as an actor, I would say the way the EU is looked at is more of a very good partner in trade and economic relations, but also distant from the realities of the region in Central Asia and in Kazakhstan. Within the context of the war, there was this intensification of relations between the EU and Central Asian countries, particularly Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, because of the development of the Middle Corridor, because basically they became the Central Asian countries became this, they occupied the middle of this trade route between Asia and Europe. So in a way, they, I don't want to use the word profit, but there was a gain. There was an economic gain straight out of the war. And that adds more layers to the nuances of the official stance vis-a-vis the conflict at the moment. But moving forward with the rapid development of relationship between the EU and Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Central Asian countries in general, there are still many open questions. Like, for example, if just take the economic development, for example, if this is going to be just a trade, that's just a transit route, or is it going to lead to trade? So trade and transit, two different concepts. So this is one of the things that, in the context of the relationship between EU and Central Asia, needs to be addressed. Overall, I would say the EU as an international actor who could help end the war is gradually leaving the scene in the public discourse, and that is evident with the resurfacing of the debate around the war as Trump came back to the office. So now the media is, at least, well, for the first 6 months, the media was overexcited. The people were overexcited that, okay, maybe this is the solution. Maybe this can put an end to it. Because as I said, regardless of where the responsibility is put or who initiated it or where you put the blame in Central Asia, because of the historical context and background and the linkages between the populations of all three countries, everybody wants to see the end of the war. That is, no questions asked, that is the hope for the population in general.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, from your interventions, we can see that there are mixed signals, right, and mixed results in most of the cases. So let's move to the third one, which can be a very short one, like recommendations for the European Union, what can be improved, not only, right, to improve its perceptions, but also how they could uphold these values which I mentioned at the beginning. And then we will open the for a short Q&A with the public.
Okay, the first two questions are actually based on the my understanding of Korean perceptions, and the third questions, right, the recommendation to the EU might be my own recommendation. Okay, so basically, I agree with the rest comments, right? The first thing EU has to do is to focus on developing some kind of effective measures to bring this long war to end. So that is the first thing the EU has to prepare and EU has to pay attention to. And secondly, it is much more the future things the EU has to think about. from the international perspective, I believe that EU is some kind of actors like driving the world democracy based on norm-based and practice-based approach. And this kind of norm-based and practice-based drive for the world democracy has been weakened during this Russian-Ukraine war, because the democratic country in the world society is dividing between like the US versus EU and US versus some other countries. And we take different approach toward the Russia-Ukraine war, and suggest different solutions to that kind of the tragedies. So that is what we see right now, and I think that after if there is sooner or later the war ends, then the European Union has to prepare how to strengthen the traditional norm-based and practice-based drive for the world democracy. That is what the EU has to prepare for the world society. And domestically, this is the final one. I believe that the EU has to prepare some kind of some bad things. I expect two bad things. The first one is that before the Russia-Ukraine war, there was some kind of problems internally of the European society because of the immigration issues and economic turmoil, right? But the Russian and Ukraine war stops that kind of domestic issues, internal issues of the evolving more seriously within the European society. But some of the country in the France or some other countries in the western part of this European society, they actually experience that kind of internal problems has been aggravated even during this Russian-Ukraine war. I expect that this kind of like immigration issues and economic crisis issues in the European society will be much more aggravated after the Russia-Ukraine war ends. So you have to prepare how to deal with that kind of internal conflict resulting from this immigration and economic crisis issues you experienced before the Russian and Ukraine war. That would be the first one. And second one, in dealing with the Russian and Ukraine war, the EU actually contribute differently. The member state of the EU, as far as I know, contribute different levels in the Russian and Ukraine war. Some countries pay much for that war, and the other countries are deviating from paying or contributing to that war economically or materialistically. So maybe after the war, that kind of overall evaluation, how differently contribute to end the war, that would be another potential issue which can be emerged as conflict issues within the European society. So you have to also prepare if that kind of issues of different level of contributions to end the Russian-Ukraine war becomes the serious domestic or internal issues of the EU, and how you can deal with that kind of issues. You have to prepare that kind of aspect. That is what I'm thinking now.
Probably I'll move to the other direction, because I think one of the problems before that I mentioned, that the EU has this image problem, right? You have the values, but at the same time you are seen by many probably in Global South. I don't like the term Global South, but there are different countries who see this double standard, right? So the one way to go probably to strengthen the consistency of that norms, of that values, but then based on, or this is just a discussion we had before with Thaddeus, and also listening to what Mariam presented in the other panel, the other option is to move into a more strategic, pragmatic actors, right? Why don't you try? Why don't you try to do that? At least in Southeast Asia, or maybe in the Indo-Pacific, try to be more pragmatic, what they actually needs, instead of pushing all the norms and be seen as a double standard because of the inconsistent application, then probably it's twisted. So if the countries there need capacity building, if the country there needs actual defense cooperations with the EU, or joint exercise or whatever, basically putting more strategic pragmatic options there, instead of pushing all the values. That's the other direction that the EU can take. Of course, then I'm not saying that you abandon all the values, but again, there is a big problem there because you've been seen as this inconsistent actors, right? That's one. Second one, because countries in Southeast Asia already sees the EU as a potential balancer of this great power tension. Again, being strategic and pragmatic, probably enter that domain and push for whatever the EU does best. In that sense, one thing that I really probably have to, especially for the Indonesian case, probably distance the EU from the US at the moment, especially after what happened with X, with all the last 2-3 days in X is just basically constant EU bashing the EU and so on because of the not the sanction, what is it, some 100 millions that the EU asked X to pay. And then there was this constant bashing of the EU there, right? But that is actually opening up the potential that the EU is now distancing itself from the US instead of always following or trying to cooperate with the US there. So maybe also the same in Indonesia, pushing the EU as a bloc, pushing the narrative that the EU itself is an independent actor, very different compared to the US especially in this case, would probably be more helpful in that sense. Probably I'll stop there.
It is actually very difficult to try to conjure recommendations for EU. The first would be to formulate a new way of diplomacy, especially in Southeast Asia, because in Southeast Asia, not only EU, but also Russia start to invest more in the region with its greater Eurasian visions, which try to converge two different theaters, the Europe and Asia. And on the other hand, EU is also seen trying to do similar things by converging two different theaters, in the Pacific, especially with regards to Taiwan Straits and to what happened in Ukraine at the moment. And a couple of months ago, we had this discussion in Singapore. And although Singapore is the only country in Southeast Asia that immediately condemn Russia for their aggression as well as to impose sanction, they too refuse the convergence of two theaters and to bring the war here, a war that we have no interest to join. The second is that the EU must acknowledge that Russia, for whatever happened today, still seen as a reliable geopolitical alternative for many of Southeast Asian countries. And although we have the same interests with the EU about democracy, about human rights, about non-interference, about territorial integrity, and the fact that war in Ukraine, war between Russia and Ukraine might be the most fatal war after the World War II. I think the current number of casualties has reached around 1 million as of now. It is still a war that Southeast Asia don't want to be involved. However, we are finding for the EU actually to solve the problem internally. And the third is, while EU is dealing with internal issues, while at the same time it has to rely upon itself in the and the withdrawing of the US from Europe, we also feel that EU needs to do some soul searchings as well. The image of stronger German is actually quite unsettling for some. The announcement that German, for example, will spend 3.5 to 5% of its GDP for defense is evoking a past memory of World War II. I think the idea of security arrangement in Europe has been to keep Russia out, to keep US in and to keep Germans down. And where are you now? I think I will stop there.
Well, I have recommendations on the security front as well as the values front. On the security front, as I mentioned earlier, we want to see continued intervention of European countries in the Russian-Ukraine ceasefire in order to make sure that the ceasefire is not going to benefit Russia unjustifiably. So that's so important. And well, we would love to see the continued division of labor amongst countries and amongst people like von der Leyen, Macron, Meloni, and maybe Finnish Prime Minister as well. And on the values front, I actually have slightly a different view from the rest. Well, I actually wonder whether EU is really pushing its values. I don't really see that. Well, it's for sure better for other countries if those that believe in the values of democracy and human rights speak about it in different languages, because democracy and human rights tend to be considered so ideological. So it's better to use much more like good governance type of terminologies. But still, I think EU has been doing really well in this front. And the current situation, I'm concerned rather, is that because after the U.S. Nearly withdrawal from the support of Ukraine, European countries had to step up to increase the security budget. And so most of the budget goes for the security vis-a-vis democracy-related things. And so, even when we look at the most recent European Democracy Shield, I was actually struck to see how inward-looking it was. And so in that sense, I would want to see Europe being more confident about a normative power and one and only normative power.
I will just say a few things about the Kazakhstani context, not necessarily just regarding the war in Ukraine. And the first one will be a little bit in continuation to what Curry just said, as the alternative power out there. So for Kazakhstan, there is an embeddedness in terms of the security architecture and the trade and embeddedness of and the interconnection of the economies, and it is there. And then while at the same time we would like to see more in-depth engagement with the EU, I would say that the EU needs to acknowledge that playing field, that those structures do exist, that Kazakhstan is a part of the Eurasian Economic Union. Basically, it's open market with Russia, that it is a part of CIS, that it is a part of CSTO architecture, security architecture. So those facts are there, and Kazakhstan is not going to leave those. While, of course, there is the political will to expand engagement with the EU on all different fronts. Another thing, I think it's a little bit contrary to what you just said. I am actually pro beyond border measures, like non-tariff measures, like GSP Plus, and so I think those are good vehicles for transfer of norms in such a way that both parties would benefit. So I think that is a good vehicle, and that definitely would, Kazakhstan would definitely benefit from those. And the last thing is that all Central Asian countries, and Kazakhstan in particular, have been affected by secondary sanctions heavily, and that has negative effect on the image of the EU in the region. Just during the past month, there were 3 different attacks on CPC pipelines, which carry 80% of Kazakhstan's oil exported to EU. So both sides are losing out of those attacks, because it cuts the oil supply to Europe, and then Kazakhstan basically is losing infrastructure. And it was launched from Ukraine. So this is a very, I would say this particular issue is something that could have a negative effect on future of cooperation and also general stance on the war.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you also for the recommendations. It's very interesting. Thank you for the contribution. Before we move to the Q&A, a big round of applause for all 5 panelists. We still have some minutes for some questions from the public.
Okay, I have a question actually. So there's been a lot said about the geopolitical effects and the normative effects of the war in Ukraine towards the rest of the world. Actually, this one is for Kazakhstan. I am curious because I distinctly remember sometime in, I believe it was 2023, there was increased tension in the area because I believe it was a bunch of Russian truck drivers decided to displace Russian military symbols on their vehicle, and some locals did not like that. And there was talk about how, because I remember roughly that there was something along the lines, I think it was a Russian parliamentary member that said this, but they said that something along the lines of a third of Kazakhstan is ethnically Russian, therefore a third of Kazakhstan should go to us. They said something like this, but of course there was no way they could back it up with a military force because everyone's in Ukraine at the time. But is Kazakhstan concerned about this? Because even if Russia fails in this, Russia is still a country of 140 million, a nuclear power, and even if China dethrones it, it'll still be the 3rd largest military power on the earth. And second question, this one is more open. But okay, so I think that there is a little mysticism about the Russian elite and just political elites in general, as of them having very little, they don't really get affected by the political bias of the masses. But after we witness Putin's little speech with Tucker Carlson, I believe it was, on the interview, and where he basically went on a 2-hour-long rant about how Ukraine is not really a country, using historic conspiracy theories to justify his perception as such. And then through my personal, I will not say what event it was, but it was a speech by a member of the Indonesian military, where it was not a part of the agenda, but for some reason he went on something like a 10-minute rant about the LGBT mind virus or something like that, which is also in Russian propaganda a big thing. So this one is for everyone in the panel. What do you guys think? What do you, ladies and gentlemen in front of me, think about the cultural aspect of this war? Like, is there a chance that the Russian government is just filled with people that have bought into these weird conspiracy theories and are actually acting on it with real military action? What does that say about the state of the world today? And thank you.
Okay, I'll go for Kazakhstan first. So yes, there are crazy people in Duma, and and I would say in all parliaments around the world. So they will say things, and yes, there are reactions to them, but they usually don't last long. But the bigger picture I can give you is this: that in terms of territorial integrity, I wouldn't say Kazakhstan is worried or that it thinks that, okay, once Putin is done with Ukraine, he will come after us, because the nature of relationship is completely different. Right now, there are over 20,000 Russian companies who have moved to Kazakhstan. Somewhere around 30 or 40,000 IT professionals moved from Russia to Kazakhstan. So they are bringing expertise, they are bringing investment and so on. And the relationship in economic terms, macroeconomic terms, is actually quite good. There aren't any points of tension that would lead to such a scenario not at least right now or in the foreseeable future.
I think I don't have too much to add well on that question, second question, because I think it was more well for other people, but well for most of the Japanese people, Russian war is not necessarily about territorial expansion, not necessarily about well their concern about NATO expansion. It was more about risky meal and you know the ideology that well Putin had, and even though there are a lot of whataboutism, you know, asking the moves on the Western side, we still believe that in order to preserve the international order, we have to make sure that Russia is not going to get benefited from this war.
I think you asked about social cultural aspect of the war. I remember that in early days of the invasions, we had a number of messages, you know, distributed through social media and WhatsApp, depicting the war as if it's between husband and ex-wife, and and the ex-wife cheated with with another guy, which depicts apparently depicts NATO. So the ability for the belligerents to, for Russia, I was just mentioned it, yeah, for Russia to conduct strategic communication in a way that it makes narratives that feels relevant across different social conditions, across different cultures, it what makes them winning the narratives in many parts of the world, including in Indonesia. And I think this is especially concerning because a lot of us, we have the technology, but we don't really know how to, you know, differentiate between disinformation and the truth. I think there's that is the social cultural aspect of the war. Russia doesn't really have any big social cultural footprints in Indonesia, and we have K-pop from Korea. We have always wanted to go to Japan as our first, you know, country to travel, but I don't think any of you want to go to Korea to visit, you know, as the first tourist destination. But we do appreciate their culture, like ballet, you know, high profile culture. But that doesn't really resonate to all of us, only for the elite. Yeah.
To be honest, I actually don't know what. But yeah, so there are 2 points. One is not that serious. So I mean, because it's already 6:25. So I actually have a course on Russian politics and society next semester, and we actually discuss all the different dimensions of Russian inside Russia and how it actually affect the decision-making process. But I think that's what you are asking. Maybe if I can extrapolate the question further, if you believe that Russian policymakers, decision makers can act like that, for example, if, again, it's a like future scenario, if Putin, you know, gone, would that change basically the Russian foreign policy? Because it's basically what you are saying is that it's not only Putin, but other people inside the Russian government, Russian society have the same conspiracy theories, way of thinking. And I mean, I don't think I can answer that at the moment, but you can see there are already, I think, research done on how conspiracy theories is quite rampant in Russian society, and how the government use it. I agree with Kuri. Sometimes the government use it for its justification, but you look at how they talk, you look at how they speak, you look at how they talk to each other in their medias. See the Russian version of the discussion. Sometimes you get overwhelmed by all those things. So what I'm saying is, I think I don't think it's only Putin. Maybe there are different factions inside the Russian government, but to say that they all have the conspiracy theories, meaning that all of them have their belief in that, probably not. I mean, again, it's too simplistic, and I think we need to discuss like which part. One of the not a promotion, but one part of the course next semester that I'm going to teach is that we discuss specifically several ideas about the conspiracy ideas that are quite popular in Russia, and see how the government actually responded to that. So if you're interested, we can discuss it further.
Yeah, my answer is very simple, yes. The Russia-Ukraine war might be very related to some kind of discrimination related to the ethnicity and some kind of cultures. So after the modernization, the human beings in society, all the countries, we are experiencing some kind of discrimination in the nation state. And we try to weaken and solve that kind of issues within the borders and each borders. That is our human beings' effort. And the war is some kind of tragedy where that kind of bad things of human beings happen more prominently and more diversely. So it is clearly might be related to the kind of issues. But the right questions would be whether there is some kind of relevance. It's not a good question. But the more good questions would be what we will learn from the kind of realities from the Russian war.
Okay, we have still one question, very short one, maybe only to one of the panelists. Lady there in the front.
Hi, I'm Anissa Bugrea from the European University Institute, postdoctoral researcher. Actually, it was to all the panelists, but feel free to only let a couple people answer. But from what I gather, the EU is kind of having an identity crisis. They don't really know, are we a normative actor? Are we a geopolitical actor? And I hear a lot about like normative power Europe, and Europe needs to push more of its norms, but you've also touched upon like the hypocrisy with the genocide in Gaza versus Ukraine, democratic backsliding, gender backsliding, Hungary being anti-LGBTQ. So I guess my question was, how do your countries perceive the EU? Do you see it as a normative power? Do you see the value? Does the EU itself see the value in being a normative power? And otherwise, what is there beyond? Because the EU says itself, the global gateway, we are on the one hand, we are a normative power, and that's why we are different from China, and that's why we are the good empire. And on the other hand, it says, but we want, we have a lot of decolonization to do with our relationship with Africa or Indonesia, whatever, and also are a geopolitical actor. So can you be normative and a geopolitical actor?
Can you pick two?
I don't know, they can choose. Whoever wants to answer, whoever is eager, I guess.
Pick two.
I don't know, maybe Japan and Korea.
Okay.
So from Japan, well, we would say that, I would say that, Europe should not give up the normative aspect. Geopolitical struggle is indeed occupying the attention of everybody, but the strength in EU is really with the normative aspect. And so, for example, in the book Goodbye Hegemony, EU is presented as such, while China is considered as more economic actor, and the US is more considered as a military actor. So the identity should remain there. And also, if the EU sort of gives up the idea of normative actor, it would not be able to stop the wave of populism, xenophobia, and unilateralism further. And so we have to have a coordinated effort to intentionally bring, to the termination of this kind of wave.
Yeah. In South Korea, we actually respect the kind of normative drive for the world democracy made by the European Union. All kind of issues you raised about normative areas, that is our, we actually learn from the European practice. So we actually have some kind of respect for the European society in that respect. But in realities, like Russia-Ukraine war shows that that kind of normative approach does not work very well. So by just emphasizing normative things, that does not becomes any kind of solutions for the world, resolving the problems of the world society. That is what the Professor Raito, Raito also said about that. So maybe Koreans, we also take the very similar approach to the Indonesian case. We hope that the EU might little deviate from emphasizing too much about the normative approach and take some kind of practical stance in the world issues. That would be what the Korean people think about Europe. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. With that, I would like to conclude this roundtable. Again, a big round of applause, please, for the panelists. I would like to remind you that this event was live recorded by BINUS Television and it will be available also at the EU Values website. If someone would like to disseminate it, use it for teaching, I would also kindly ask you to follow us, the EU Values website, right? We have already a lot of stuff on democracy, human rights, security, multilateralism, which can be disseminated, which is very related also to the topics of this panel and our conference in general. And right now we would like to kindly invite you to tea and coffee at the reception. Okay, thank you.
Okay, before we conclude today's program, we kindly invite to all speakers and panelists to remain in the auditorium for a group photo.
When is your flight?
Sorry.
You always know, but remember Chile.
Okay, thank you